So we saw the imperative version of this code, and then we improved it by using some OOP with a class keyword, which is not really like an OOP class, but that's okay. And before we move on to what I dare say is the best way to do this with more of a functional approach, there's something we can clean up here, which applies to all programming languages basically, and it definitely will come back to us whenever we get into the functional approach. So here in the constructor function, we have three parameters. And as a general rule in programming, there's this thing called clean code or clean code principles based on a famous book by Robert C. Martin in 2003. And one of the guiding principles in there is that anytime you're creating any sort of a function or method, again, doesn't matter what language it is, whenever you specify parameters, you really don't want to have more than two parameters. Like, think for a second if this was like more of a person, we might have to have a lot of parameters like name, age, address, hobbies, ID number, salary, marital status. The list goes on. And that's going to be pretty unwieldy to work with, mainly because we have to keep track of the order of things. Wait, does name go in first? Does age go in first? So even here, there's only three things here, so it's pretty easy. I mean, I have the code right here, but it's not inconceivable that maybe I get confused. Maybe I'm like, okay, I want a step of 1, I want to start at 0 and end at 10. I intend this to be step, start, and stop. But in this case, I've kind of mixed this up now. 1 is going to be the start, the end is going to be 0, and the step is 10. That clearly makes no sense. So in other words, this requires more like focus and cognitive load, and if we have a lot of things going on, the argument from clean code is that anything more than 2 parameters is unwieldy to work with, so try not to have more than 2 parameters. So what is a solution here? Well, let me switch this back to how it was. One of the simplest solutions, and maybe you can conceive of it, instead of having 3 individual pieces of primitive data, what if we just accepted one single object? Because then the order wouldn't matter. We would just have to have the right properties or key names. Let's see what that would look like. So in here, instead of taking 3, I'm just going to take one object. And I'm just going to call that props or properties. To use this, I would now say props.start. Now it doesn't matter what the order is. I just have to pass in a single object, and I just need to know the names of the keys. So now I can come in here, and instead of doing it like this, I would do it like this. So this is not bad. I can put step in front of here. I can alphabetize these. I can do whatever I want. It doesn't matter. I'm sending in one argument. There's only one parameter, which is what clean code wants. And so now, since this is an object, we can say props.start, props.end, props. As long as I know the names of the things, the order no longer matters. So that is an improvement. There's actually a couple other things we can do in here. This is kind of annoying. Again, if this was a person, I got to do props.name, props.age, and props. It's too much. How can we improve this? Well, here comes a new concept, which is something that we're going to use still a lot in the functional side of things. And so this is more of a JavaScript thing, not necessarily other programming languages have this. But we can do what's called object destructuring. That's what it looks like. Here in the parameters, I'm going to put some braces. And in here, I'm going to call out by name the properties that I want. That's not start, stop, end, step. Now this goes back to being a little bit simpler. I can highlight one of these props. I can hit Command D to pull up multiple cursors and hit backspace. I don't have to change anything on this side. And here I have refactored this to just destructure. Now, don't get this confused. This is a parameter, a constructor function parameter. So in this case, when we have these braces, it doesn't mean that this is an object. It means that, hey, I'm a parameter. I'm expecting to receive an object. And inside of that object, I'm going to pick out this value of start, end, and step. So this is our object that we're making, our object literal. We're passing this in. It's just one argument for one parameter. And in this parameter, we're doing destructuring. And we're saying, hey, you're going to give us just one object, so that way the order of things doesn't matter. Just make sure the actual names of the properties are correct. And as long as that's the case, we can just pull start, end, and step. And then we don't have to say props dot, or we don't have to keep using the dot notation. So that's destructuring. We can take this a step further. We can actually provide some default values in here. So we can say, look, if you don't tell us the start, we're just going to start at 0. If you don't tell us the end, we're going to end at 10. And if you don't tell us the step, we're just going to go step by 1. So then now at this point, I can just do like this. Or whatever it is. You know, maybe I want to start at 5 or something. I think this was supposed to be maybe 1. Right? Whatever it's supposed to be. So now I can just arbitrarily pass in what I want. If I don't care about the end or the step, I'll just send the start. And so the start will be 5, but whatever I don't send in is going to use these default values. So these are a couple of things that are going to come back, especially in anytime we're writing functions going forward. As they get more complex, you're going to want to apply these types of principles. So limit the number of parameters to 2. Take advantage of using an object as a parameter, and take advantage of destructuring that object. Not only that, but take advantage of default values. So that way, when you call the function, you don't even need to pass in all that stuff. You can just destructure what you need, and you can supply default values. One last thing here is I might say, oh, you know what? I don't even care. Just use the defaults. I'm just going to call new counter. I'm not even going to pass anything in. Unfortunately, that may not work as expected. And run into an error. Why? Because what happens if we don't pass anything in here? This is undefined. So if you pass in undefined, I can't destructure anything from undefined. So there's one last step we can do here, and that is this. We can actually say, look, if you don't pass us an object at all, guess what? We're going to set a default as an empty object. And since now we have an empty object, we can go ahead and destructure what we need. And since you didn't give us anything, we're just going to use our default values here. So this is a pretty common pattern to take away. So in sum, when you're writing, so here we're using it for a constructor function, but in any type of function that you're writing, if you have a lot of parameters, more than 2, then strongly consider using this object destructuring technique. Consider if you can, sometimes it doesn't make sense to give a default value, but whenever possible, give some default values. And to really cover the bases, make sure you even specify a default empty object in case somebody calls your function without passing anything in.